All right, let's say our last Divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, rule of the universe, who made us holy with your commandments and command us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah.
That's funny.
All right. So we start off with a joke. Who was purple and changed the course of Jewish history? Alexander the Great. All right. So let's do the prequel of Hanukkah on one foot so that everybody is clear what we are talking about. Chanukah is a winter Jewish holiday that commemorates events which took place in the Second Temple period after the Bible was closed. While the story of Hanukkah is well known by many, how we got there is less well known. So, some biblical grounding to help us get from the Torah to where we are talking about today. Around 1200 BCE, the Israelites crossed into the land of Israel under Joshua. We know this because the pottery changes at that point. We also know this because about that time, in the places where the Israelites were said to have lived, there's suddenly an absence of pig bones in the archaeological strata. Around 1000 BCE, Solomon built the first temple.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I've turned it off. Oh, I'm sorry, just spam.
All right. In 722 BCE, the Assyrians conquer and depopulate the northern kingdom of Israel. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom of Judah and destroy the first temple. And in 539, the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire. So, what questions do we have about how we got up to the Persians being in charge? Okay. Seeing no questions, we will continue from here. So, here is the short version of what happens after that. First, Alexander the Great and the Greeks, sounds like a band, conquer the Persian Empire. Second, after Alexander dies, his generals split up Alexander's territory. Judea ends up belonging to Ptolemy, who's the general, along with Egypt. Third, eventually the Seleucids conquered Judea and attached it to Syria. Fourth, Antiochus IV outlaws Judaism in order to forcibly Hellenize Judea. And fifth, the Maccabees lead a rebellion that eventually succeeds. So, this is the abstract, if this were a paper. It's the blurb, except it gives away the ending. If it were a book, it's the cliff notes. So now that we have a skeleton in our head of this story, now we can start hanging the details. Are there questions just looking at the short version? Some of your questions we might answer later on, some we might not. So this is a good time to raise your questions now.
David, about how long did it take from number 1 to number 5?
Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire in 331, and the Maccabees reclaim the temple in 165 BCE.
Okay.
100 years.
So about 175 years, I guess, ish.
David, who are the Seleucids?
Seleucids, so Alexander has 3 main generals, all of whom we will meet. Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Antigonus eventually he ends up with Greece. Ptolemy eventually ends up with Egypt, and Seleucus eventually ends up with Syria. Although these these territories ebb and flow. The rulers of Seleucus's territory, his dynasty, generally all take the name Seleucus this, Seleucus that, Seleucus the other, with lots of Roman numerals. Same thing with Ptolemy, actually. So they become known as the Seleucids. And then their counterparts are the Ptolemies. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? All right. The other point that I'm going to make now, because I think you have enough information for this to make sense, is that in the story of Hanukkah, it's not always clear who the Jews are fighting. Sometimes they're fighting, in some versions, they're fighting the Syrians. In some versions, they're fighting the Greeks. In some versions, they're fighting the Syrian Greeks. So now you can see, and you'll be able to see a lot better by the time we're done, that they are fighting the Syrian Greeks because they are Syrians who have adopted Greek culture. Because Alexander the Great took over Syria, among other places, and Hellenized it into Greek culture. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Let's dive into the long version now. We've got 175 years to get to or so. So we're going to start with Alexander the Great, 333 to 323 BCE. And although everything that I'm going to say is on the screen, I am saying it out loud because, one, sometimes we have people who phone in and can't read the screen. And two, some people learn in different ways. Some people learn better by hearing, some people learn better by seeing. And three, I'm not going to make any assumptions as to how big the font is on your screen. So I'm going to read it all. So in 336 BCE, Philip the Macedonian is assassinated and his son Alexander takes over. He is only 20 years old. By 2 years later, 334 BCE, he has control over all of the Greek city-states. So Athens, Sparta, Corinth, places like that. And he's molded them into Macedonian control and attacked the Persian Empire in Asia Minor, which we would now think of as Turkey. A year later, 333 BCE, Alexander beats Darius III and the Persians, another good band name, at Issus, which is in northeastern Syria. So now that he's won this battle, Alexander wants to protect his southern flank by conquering Egypt. Moreover, while he has control of much of the land of the Persian Empire, the Persian fleet still is out there, and he doesn't want them to be able to access any ports. So if he can control all the coastal ports, then he can control the Eastern Mediterranean and has strategic control at sea. Doing both of these things, conquering Egypt and controlling the coastal ports, requires going through and taking over the land of Israel. On his way to do this, he starts by going through what is now modern Lebanon to get to Tyre. Tyre is a city on the mainland, but it is also an island a little bit of a distance off of the mainland, where it's one of the main Persian naval ports. He takes the mainland without much of a trouble, but he can't get to the island because the Persians have control of the water. So what he does is he builds a land bridge from the mainland, and then he's able to attack the island from both land and with his ships. And he eventually succeeds in taking Tyre. Moving down the coast towards Egypt, Alexander takes Akko, Strato's Tower, which is now Caesarea, Azotus, which is now Ashdod and was Ashdod before it was known as Azotus to the Greeks, and Ashkelon. Then he gets to Gaza. Gaza, at that point in the 330s BCE, was a high-walled fortress on a steep rise. So in order to be able to attack it, Alexander decides that he's going to make his own high ground so that he can be level with the city. Once he has done that, he uses a combination of battering rams and catapults, plus he has sappers that are undermining the walls of Gaza, and all this together allows the Macedonians to take it over. Once he has taken Gaza, Alexander the Great journeys to Jerusalem, which opens its gates to him in 332 BCE. According to the Talmud, there is a meeting between Alexander the Great and the high priest, Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous. I have brought the Talmud's version of this meeting in the appendices, but basically what it is that the high priest goes out totally unarmed, and Alexander shows him great deference. And when his soldiers are like, why? You're the one who just took over the Persian Empire. He says, I saw this man in a dream, and I've seen him every time that the night before I've been successful every time. So I feel like this man bodes well for me, or something like that. Whether or not this happens, the fact remains that unlike cities that resisted Alexander the Great, Jerusalem opens its gates to him, and so he does not destroy it. And he treats the Jews well, which is why since then, Alex has been a popular boy's name and girl's name for Jews, despite it not being biblical. After that, Alexander goes and takes Egypt, laying out the site of Alexandria himself. In 331 BCE, Alexander returns north, traveling through Gaza, Ashdod, and Azotus, or Ashkelon and Azotus, which is now Ashdod. While he was in Egypt, the Samaritans revolted against the Greek governor, so Alexander detours to destroy Samaria before heading back to Akko and Tyre. From there, Alexander beats the Persians again at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, takes the other Persian capitals, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, and reaches India before turning back due to a mutiny and dying of a fever in Babylon in 323 BC. And here I have brought maps, so you can see his route in blue down the coast. You can see what Tyre looked like with the land bridge that he created, the mole, and then his route is in brown going back. You'll be able to look at this in greater detail when you get the source sheet.
David,
And then this is a map of Alexander the Great's conquests and his travels in about a span of 10 years or so. He was a busy man.
David,
Okay.
can I ask a quick question?
Now it's time for questions. What questions are there?
Okay. The Samaritans,
Yes.
they were allies of the Israelites, or they were not, there was no political affiliation. They were really very separate. Do you know where where that stood?
Yeah, the Samaritans, when they had the chance, they did not get along with the Israelites. At this point, they were just the next province over, all under the rule of the Persians and then under the rule of the Greeks. Previously, the Samaritans had been brought in, I want to say by the Assyrians, after the Assyrians conquered and depopulated the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. They brought in other people to take over that place so that they wouldn't, since they weren't in their own homeland, they wouldn't be as troublesome, was the thinking. And the Samaritans caused problems for the Israelites. So when the Israelites were allowed back by the Persians and wanted to build a second temple, they were attacked by the Samaritans. And so we get the story of the, quote, Good Samaritan in the New Testament as a way of saying that these people who caused problems and therefore were disliked, some of them were still good people. But that's where the Samaritans are.
Okay.
David?
Yeah.
So as Alexander was going through these various provinces and eventually getting towards Jerusalem and Judea and was conquering all these areas, did he kind of consider them all kind of homogeneous? Did he know, for example, that the Israelites were very distinct in terms of their religion or anything about the Torah? I mean, what was his knowledge base about that, David, do you think?
Yeah, he knew that these were all different peoples and that they were all doing their own thing. And Alexander's policy was similar to the Persian policy, which is, we want you to not cause us problems and we would like you to pay us taxes. But we figure that if we leave you alone to do your own thing, you will be happy with us and will not cause us problems. So he knew that the Jews were different religiously and culturally. He was fine with it. He didn't really have the time to try to impose Hellenization, even if he wanted to, because he was too busy trying to take over more of the Persian Empire and bring it under his control. While he nominally was in control of it after defeating Darius III twice, each of the provinces of the Persian Empire was controlled by a satrap, which is a term that comes up in the translations of the Megillat Esther. And so in order to make sure that he really had control, he had to go and defeat any satraps that might try to challenge his control of the Persian Empire, which is why he goes all over the place in Central Europe.
I have also a quick question, David.
Yeah.
In Jerusalem at this time, what faction, if any, is actually in control of like the priestly establishment there and such? I mean, I would assume this is way before the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. What's going on over there internally?
Yeah, it's we still have the high priest lineage and the priesthood running the religious affairs as they had been, and then there's a Jewish governor who reports to whoever was in charge. Nehemiah was a Jewish governor, for instance, under the Persians. He has a book of the Bible named for him, one of the last ones. So there's someone who's in charge of civil affairs, and there's a governor of sorts, and then there's the high priest who's in charge of religious affairs. But they haven't really divided into factions like they will.
So this is kind of pre-factionalism, sort of. Exactly. Is it the structure that's happening right here roughly the same as the one created by Nehemiah? Is this basically his institution, or like the
basically? Yeah, the system that he set up is still running at this point.
Say again, I'm sorry?
The system that he set up is still running at this point.
Oh, okay. I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yes.
Gaza you said it was under Persian rule. Was it a Persian city? Was it a Jewish city under Persian rule? Was it, the inhabitants from another group and under Persian rule? Do you know?
It was. The resistance was put up by the Persian military forces there. As to who was living in Gaza, I don't know.
Okay. I can try to find out.
Interesting question.
Oh, I also have another related question, if it's okay.
Yeah.
I know that Carthage is a thing, I think right now, maybe.
Mhm.
Is
Yeah.
is Tyre and Carthage actually separated right now into officially like different things, or are they is that like is Carthage just like Tyre's big border gore in some other part of the world right now?
Tyre and Carthage were both Phoenician cities. What the relationship was between them at this point, I don't know, but I'll find out.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's find out what happens after Alexander the Great dies. Also, there was a question in the chat about whether Alexander's birth was prophesied in the book of Daniel. We'll come back to that, and if we don't address that question by the end of the class, ask it again, whoever put in the chat. All right. Oh, here's a nice picture. This is from a mosaic from Pompeii of the Battle of Issus, and we have Darius III in the middle, looking back at Alexander the Great on the left. This is the go-to picture in any book that's going to have a picture of Alexander versus the Persians, because it is an old mosaic. And then here we have a map of Alexander the Great's empire, so you can see how far it stretched from Greece through Egypt all the way to India. All right, so now we go to Antigonus from 323 to 301 BC. So after Alexander the Great dies, he has not done what any corporate strategist would suggest, which is have a succession plan. So his generals seek control of the pieces of his empire, and the land of Israel was particularly desirable because it had the harbors that allowed for control of the Eastern Mediterranean. The way that things were supposed to work, based off of the discussions that Antigonus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy have, was that Antigonus was supposed to have Asia Minor, Syria, and Judea, and Greece. And Seleucus was supposed to have Mesopotamia and Persia and everything east to India. And Ptolemy was supposed to have Egypt and Libya. However, by 320, so 3 years later, Ptolemy, now known as Ptolemy I, who was based in Egypt, had control of the land of Israel. See if you can keep track of how many times the land of Israel is controlled by various people. So then his fellow general Antigonus pushes south from Asia Minor and conquers Tyre, Joppa, and Gaza. So now Antigonus has the land of Israel. In 312 BCE, Antigonus is busy in Asia Minor, and his son Demetrius is in charge in Gaza. So Ptolemy beats Demetrius and forces him back to Asia Minor. So now Ptolemy has the land of Israel. Antigonus leads a large force into the land of Israel and drives out Ptolemy. Now Antigonus has the land of Israel. As Ptolemy and his forces retreat southward, they destroy Akko, which is later called Ptolemais, Samaria, Joppa, and Gaza, to deny Antigonus the use of any of these places as forward bases. In 311 BCE, Antigonus sends his son Demetrius to attack the Nabateans at Petra, modern-day Georgia, in order to get control of the Arabian spice trade and the resources of the southern Dead Sea. The Nabateans win, inflicting heavy losses on the Greeks. Around 301 BCE, Ptolemy teams up with his other fellow general, Seleucus, to defeat Antigonus. Antigonus loses to Seleucus. Ptolemy actually doesn't get his forces there in time, at Ipsus in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. After the battle, Antigonus's territories are divided up. He still gets to keep Greece, and Seleucus is supposed to get Judea. However, by that point, Ptolemy has realized that the land of Israel is super useful as a buffer zone to keep Egypt from getting invaded. So he takes over Israel. And Seleucus doesn't want to fight his friend and ally over this land. This is Seleucus the First, and Ptolemy the First we're talking about. So Judea becomes ruled by the Ptolemies. And this is what the map of Alexander the Great's empire now looks like. All right, questions about this phase of the history?
Question,
Yeah,
is what you refer to as Joppa what we refer to as Jaffa today?
yes,
So would that be the harbor they were using, they were trying to control?
yes. Jaffa and Joppa are the same thing,
Yeah.
because a Fe and a Pe are one dot apart.
Was there already a harbor in Haifa? I mean, I know a lot that's been built out in modern times, but before that, was there?
I don't know. I'll find out.
Thank you.
You're welcome. These are good questions.
I can actually say a little something about that. The coastline at Jaffa, as well as further south, Ashdod and Ashkelon, which are now both ports, they were ancient ports, but the only way the Romans were able to make use of the port of Jaffa is by building out into the water with these gigantic stone structures to basically create safe spaces for their ships. Whereas Haifa is a natural harbor. It's literally the only natural harbor between the mouth of the Nile River and halfway across the Asian Minor peninsula that's now Turkey. So the interesting question is, what building skills did the various conquerors have in terms of being able to make man-made harbors out of the fairly smooth coastline at Jaffa, Ashkelon, and Ashdod, as opposed to the fact that there's that little hook in the coastline, which is a natural harbor where Haifa is nowadays.
All right, thank you. Other questions about Antigonus and his time?
David,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yep.
Okay, so the map that you're showing, that brown area, that's all that was conquered by Alexander the Great?
Everything, yes, everything from Turkey to India, including Egypt, was all conquered by Alexander the Great. And this shows you how it was divided up by his generals after Antigonus was left with just Greece. So now we're looking at 275-ish BCE.
So the Jews,
You went.
so the Jews were not able to defeat anybody until Antiochus. Is that how it worked?
Yes, until the Jews. I don't know that the Jews wanted to defeat anybody. Like, they were used, ever since the Persians in 539 BCE, they were used to being ruled by other people, and they were kind of okay with it as long as they got to do their own thing. Yes, they had to pay taxes, but as long as nobody bothered them too much, like, they didn't care who was theoretically in charge. It would be nice if their armies weren't tromping through their fields. But beyond that, like, stability is good. And if a foreign empire can bring stability, as long as they don't cause problems, the Jews are not going to, like, try to kick anybody out. It's only when we get to Antiochus IV later on that he starts messing with them, so they start getting upset. All right. Speaking of Antiochus, we should get through the next section first, so we have time for Antiochus. Okay, Ptolemies. So these are the Egyptians. The Ptolemies, who are based in Alexandria, reorganized Judea into new districts and post military garrisons and colonies within it so as to keep anybody else from getting to invade Egypt. They rename various cities, old cities, so Akko becomes Ptolemais, Beit Sha'an becomes Scythopolis, Dor becomes Dora, Rabbah becomes Philadelphia. Yes, there was a Philadelphia before Pennsylvania.
Oh,
In Jerusalem, the high priest had some civil authority, and all of the religious authority, and the Ptolemies didn't interfere as long as the quite high taxes were paid. During the time of the Ptolemies, cultural Hellenization starts to infiltrate Judea. And this was particularly the case amongst a group of people known as the Tobiads, because they were related to a guy named Tobias, who interfaced with the Ptolemaic government. So they were exposed to Greek ways of doing things, and they started adopting some of them while continuing to worship in Jewish ways and celebrate Jewish holidays. Jews also moved to Egypt. They go all over the country, but especially to Alexandria. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great, hence its name, but Ptolemy I, otherwise known as Ptolemy Soter, wanted to become the commercial capital of the Mediterranean, and he, quote, recruited Jews to help him with this. I put recruited in quotation marks because there was a destruction layer of Ashkelon that dates to this guy's time, and this may have had something to do with his recruitment efforts. Because eventually most of the Jews in Egypt speak Greek and not Hebrew, the Bible is translated into Greek, which we now call the Septuagint, during the time of Ptolemy II. The Jews of Egypt continue to pray facing Jerusalem, donate a half shekel per person for the upkeep of the Jerusalem temple as is prescribed in the Torah, and regularly travel to Jerusalem for holiday sacrifices. So they are good diaspora Jews. We know much of what we know about this time from the book The Wisdom of Ben Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sirach, this is a book that is also in the Apocrypha in the Catholic Bible, along with the first and second books of Maccabees and the book of Judith. So the version of Ben Sirach that we have says that Ben Sirach's grandson is translating his grandfather's Hebrew text into a Greek text. It gives us a date, which we can trace to 132 BCE. So we know that this is describing the time that the Ptolemies were in charge of Judea. Eventually, it was discovered that the Hebrew did exist, that this wasn't just made up. because it was found in the Cairo Geniza and then in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Ben Sirach talks about every book of the Bible except for Daniel, which indicates that all of them were in place by that point, except for Daniel, as we will find out. And during the book of Ben Sirach, he recaps Jewish history up to that point and gives us the name of the high priest of his time, which allows us to date when he's writing between 220 BC and 195 BCE. Ben Sirach says that Simon, who is the high priest, repaired the temple, fortified the sanctuary, and excavated a massive reservoir under the Temple Mount. Archaeologists know that this reservoir still exists today, although due to political sensitivities, they've not been able to go down there in the last 75 years or more. We do get a description of the rituals of the high priest in chapter 50 of this book. It talks about trumpets being blown. And then in 1969, there was a stone discovered from the southwestern wall of the temple that said this was the, quote, place of the trumpeting. So this is indicating that, yes, Ben Sirach is not just making this up. In 276, the Seleucids waged 3 wars, so these are the guys in Syria, to try to get control of Judea from the Ptolemies. All of these failed. In the 4th war, 219 to 217, Antiochus makes more progress. He takes Gaza eventually. And then Ptolemy chases Antiochus III out of the land of Israel. He comes back, eventually gets stuck at Gaza again. And then Ptolemy uses the time that has been gotten by the holdup there to chase the Seleucids out again. And then in 198, we have the big showdown, and Antiochus III wins. And now the land of Israel belongs to the Seleucids. And you can see places that are just referenced in the text. You can see where they are on the map. And this is a map of the political districts of the land of Israel under the Ptolemies. All right, questions about the land of Israel under the Ptolemies?
It's not a question, but may I do a short comment, David?
Please.
If anyone is ever in Israel and going to pray at the area by Robinson's Arch, which was set aside for egalitarian prayer, as you walk to the prayer place, you pass by the actual trumpeting stone.
Oh. Thank you.
Or I should say, it's still on the ground from where it fell. And you can see the inscription. It's very, to me, it was more meaningful than the Kotel.
Thank you, Tybal.
So the Seleucids got control from the Ptolemies in what year again? I think it's a little further down.
198 is when they finally got it. It takes a while, a lot of fighting back and forth, but they finally got control in 198 BCE.
Well, I'm comfortable. Rosa, I'm in the conflict.
All right. Let's go on to our final act of the story. The Seleucids, 198 to 165 BCE. So, we think of Antiochus as the bad guy, which is true. But confusingly, there are multiple Antiochuses. Under Antiochus III, who conquers Judea from the Ptolemies, things are pretty peaceful. So in 198, which is when he gets control, Antiochus III rules that materials for the temple can be brought into Jerusalem without paying customs duties. And he lifts some of the taxes from the Ptolemies. And he gives the Jews the right, quote, to have a form of government in accordance with the laws of their country, which is a general Seleucid policy to encourage loyalty. This means that the high priest was the head of the community. It is also true that while the Seleucids gave the Jews political and religious autonomy within their empire, they also encouraged cultural Hellenization. So they want the Jews to be aware of the benefits of the Greek world and start taking advantage of them. Not in a forcible sort of way, but let's show you what you could be interested in. And some Jews are. In 192, Antiochus tries to expand into Greece, allies himself with Hannibal, who you may remember from Roman history. This brings him into conflict with Rome. So in 190, the Romans defeat Antiochus III at land and at sea. Antiochus has to give up his land in Asia Minor and pay a huge tribute to Rome, and shortly thereafter he dies. His son, Seleucus IV, tries to get money to pay the tribute to the Romans by looting the temple in Jerusalem, but he's not successful. A little bit later, he dies. And so in 175, we got Antiochus IV, who we're going to be dealing with from now on. He is the brother of Seleucus IV and the son of Antiochus III, and he is now in charge. So, he wants his entire empire to follow Hellenistic ways. And he particularly wants the Jews, who very much do not do Hellenism, to do Hellenistic things. Part of this is so that they will feel like they belong as part of his empire and then will not re-ally themselves with the Ptolemies, who are just on the other side of the border. And part of this is just that he feels like Hellenism is the best and everybody ought to be Hellenistic. In order to get this Hellenism program underway in a much faster way than it had been going already, Antiochus IV in 174 deposes the high priest and puts his brother into the position. So his brother is Jason, a good Greek name. And to encourage Greek culture, because really that's what his puppet master wanted, Jason builds a gymnasium in Jerusalem. So this is not just like building a JCC. A gymnasium back then was a place where there were no women. Older men sat around and talked politics, and the younger men did exercises without wearing any clothing. And Jewish men were forced to show up at the gymnasium. Many Jews who were like, it's nice, what's the big deal? Started wearing Greek clothing, and including the petassos, which is a hat, a Hellenistic hat. So Jason is willing to impose cultural Hellenism, but not do more than that. So he gets deposed for another new priest, Menelaus. Antiochus tries to invade Egypt, but the Romans tell him to knock it off. Well, Antiochus is gone. Jason takes back the high priesthood from Menelaus. And then Antiochus is feeling pretty bad about the fact that he could not take Egypt. So he decides to make himself feel better by beating up on the Jews. So he loots the temple in Jerusalem, taking away the menorah and other things. He puts Menelaus back in place. Then he sends his general to pillage Jerusalem. And because a lot of it's destroyed, he says, oh, we'll rebuild it, no problem. But in the process of rebuilding, he builds the Acra, which is a fortress for his Seleucid garrison on the corner of the temple complex. So they can look down and control what's happening in the temple. And then in 167, the real fun starts. He makes a decree that says the temple will now be dedicated to Zeus. There will be a statue of Zeus in it. We'll have pigs sacrificed on the altars, and no more Jewish sacrifices, and Jews should be sacrificed to in all the villages throughout the land. Moreover, if you keep Shabbat, keep kosher, or have a copy of the Torah, you will get killed. And women who circumcise their sons will be executed along with the babies, hung around their necks. So this is all very much not good. And some Jews decide that they're going to go out to the desert and just do the Jewish thing no matter what happens. And so they get attacked on Shabbat. And they're like, the Torah says we can't fight on Shabbat, so they don't, and they all get killed. And other people look at that and they're like, we're not going to try that. Because the whole self-defense thing, we interpret the Torah differently and think that it's okay to, as the Talmud later says, break one Shabbat in order to celebrate other Shabbats. So, since it doesn't seem like you can fight back militarily, one form of protest is the Book of Daniel, which scholars trace to the time period. It is set much earlier, but there are Greek words that date from this time and not earlier. There are prophecies that are actual events occurring around 167. And this idea in the Book of Daniel of a stone toppling a mighty statue, this is considered to refer to the idol of Zeus in the temple, hoping for a David to take on the Goliath of the Syrian Greeks. And so with conflict between the Hellenized Jews and the non-Hellenized Jews, and between the Greeks, the Syrian Greeks and the Jews, the stage is set for the Maccabean revolt in 167 BCE, which brings us to Hanukkah.
Yay.
So final notes as we are at the end of our time. Here's a map of the Seleucid political districts. And here is a lovely, not terribly long story called Lights. It's a book from 1984. This video is from 1983. And it tells the story of the Hellenization process and how some Jews got caught up in that and other Jews resisted through the metaphor of lights and Greek letters versus Hebrew letters. The whole episode that we went through is talked about in the first chapter of the book of First Maccabees. So that is Appendix A for you to read, because now that you know what it's talking about, you'll be able to understand it. And then Appendix B is when Alexander the Great meets Simon the Righteous, according to the Talmud.